He drove her home. He watched her step inside. He sat there until the garage door sealed shut behind her, and then he pulled away into the dark. That is the account Tommaso Chioni gave investigators. That is the version of events he is held to from the very first conversation law enforcement initiated with him. A routine evening. A routine drive. A son-in-law doing what sons-in-law do. Nothing memorable. Nothing worth a second look. Just an ordinary Thursday night tucked into the quiet foothills of Tucson, Arizona. Except that 4 hours and 57 minutes later, at 1:47 in the morning, a masked figure materialized on the front porch of that same house, looked directly into the doorbell camera lens, and deliberately killed the feed. And Nancy Guthrie was never seen again. Welcome back to Cold Case History. I am going to walk you through every detail of this case, the footage, the forensics, the suspect behavior, the DNA, and the digital evidence trail. If you are new here, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. We cover every update on cases like this one the moment they break. And trust me, this one is not finished breaking yet. Let's begin at the beginning. What you are about to hear is not internet speculation. It is not the kind of half-formed theory that gets passed around social media before anyone has actually examined the source material. Every detail that follows comes directly from Pima County Sheriff's Department official records, verified FBI press releases, confirmed forensic timeline documentation, and federal investigation files. And when you arrange those details side by side in the correct sequence, without skipping the uncomfortable parts, the picture that emerges is one that the mainstream news cycle, in its hunger for the next headline, never had the attention span to fully assemble for you. So tonight, we are going to assemble it together. All of it. In full. It is February 1st, 2026. The Catalina Foothills neighborhood sits pressed against the northern rim of Tucson, with the Santa Catalina Mountains rising behind it like a wall. The properties up here are wide. The lots are generous. The homes sit well back from the street behind high walls and matured desert landscaping, the kind of deliberate distance that takes money to buy and decades to feel natural in. This is a neighborhood that was designed around the expectation of safety, around the assumption that the quiet here would never be interrupted in any serious way, that it had been earned and that it would hold. At 1:47 in the morning, it did not hold. A figure appears in the doorbell camera footage recovered from the residence of a single-story home in the foothills. Male. Estimated height between 5'9" and 5'10". Average underlying frame. But the silhouette does not look average, because the silhouette has been deliberately engineered not to. Multiple heavy garments have been layered over one another in a way that creates artificial bulk. The shoulder width is wrong. The torso is thickened. Every natural body measurement that a forensic analyst would use to build an identification has been buried under fabric. On his back, a black 25-liter Ozark trail hiking pack, pushed loosely into the front waistband of his pants, with no holster securing it at any angle, sits a firearm. It rides awkward and unstable against his body. He does not hesitate. He does not glance back over his shoulder. He walks directly to the camera, holds the lens in his gaze for a moment, and disconnects it. Not a malfunction. Not a power surge. A deliberate, manual disconnection by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had already decided that nothing that happened next would be recorded. The feed goes dark. The porch goes silent. And for the next 41 minutes, there is nothing. No screaming. No sirens cutting through the neighborhood. No motion lights tripping in nearby yards. No dogs. Just the desert stillness pressing in from all sides while inside that house. In that 41-minute window that the official investigation has never been able to fully account for, something was happening to an 84-year-old woman who lived alone. And here is where the name Tommaso Chioni becomes the gravitational center of this entire story. Not because he has been formally charged, not because investigators have stood at a podium and attached a label to his name, but because the forensic architecture of this case, every timestamp, every recovered piece of digital data, every behavioral signal in that camera footage, every structural failure in those ransom demands, every biological trace recovered from the front entrance of that home. When you follow any one of those threads far enough, they do not scatter in different directions. They converge. They converge on the last person to see Nancy Guthrie alive, on the man who drove her home, watched the garage door close, and disappeared down that quiet foothill street at 9:50 in the evening. We are going to walk through this evidence in layers. We are going to examine 5 specific forensic anomalies, 5 documented, confirmed, irrefutable details that the professional kidnapping narrative the headlines sold you in the first 72 hours of this case simply cannot accommodate. And by the time we reach the 5th one, I promise you that the story you were handed in those early, breathless news cycles will be unrecognizable. Now stay with me, because this is where it actually starts. And it starts with Tommaso Chioni, On the evening of Saturday, January 31st, 2026, Nancy Guthrie spent time at the home her daughter Annie shares with her husband, Tommaso Chioni. This was not an unusual arrangement. It was the kind of ordinary family evening that does not register in memory because nothing about it announces itself as significant. Tommaso Chioni is Italian-born. He is believed to be in his late 40s to early 50s. He holds a position as an AP biology teacher at Basis Oro Valley, one of the highest-ranked charter schools in the state of Arizona. He has held that position for more than 15 years. 15 years in the same classroom, same school, same subject. That is the biography of a man who chose a foundation and planted himself in it. It is the biography of a man whose life, read from the outside, contains nothing that would cause you to look twice. He had been married to Annie Guthrie for years. By every surface appearance, the marriage was functional, engaged, present. He was involved in Nancy's life the way that a son-in-law in a close family tends to be, as a regular, familiar, woven in presence. He was not peripheral to Nancy's world. He was inside it, consistently, with full knowledge of her home, her daily rhythms, her schedule, her neighborhood, and the specific architecture of her evening routine. That closeness is not a sentimental observation. It is a forensic one. What is confirmed with documentary precision is the sequence of what happened when Nancy was ready to leave that evening. At 9:48 p.m., Tommaso Chioni drove his mother-in-law back to her residence in the Catalina foothills. She went inside. At exactly 9:50 p.m., the garage door rolled down. The property went still. Tommaso Chioni drove away. In that moment, 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, 2026, garage sealed, taillights fading down the road, is the last confirmed moment Nancy Guthrie was safely inside her own home. Now here is the forensic detail that makes everything that follows it carry the weight that it does. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was, by every account from people who knew her, cognitively sharp and fully present in her own life. But her physical situation was fragile in ways that matter enormously to the forensic picture of this case. She had significant mobility limitations. She depended on a daily cardiac medication regimen, and investigators confirmed publicly that missing more than 24 hours of that medication could rapidly escalate into a life-threatening medical crisis. She wore a pacemaker. That small implanted device kept the electrical rhythm of her heart operating within its correct pattern. And that pacemaker was connected via Bluetooth to a monitoring application on her iPhone. The phone sat on her nightstand every night within arm's reach. As long as Nancy remained anywhere inside that house within the standard 30-foot Bluetooth range of that device, the signal between pacemaker and phone stayed live. The application logged her cardiac data continuously, in real time, without interruption. And the moment Nancy was moved far enough from that phone for the signal to break, the application recorded it. A timestamp, precise to the second, automatically stored in the device's data log. Irrefutable. That timestamp reads 2:28 a.m. The camera was killed at 1:47 a.m. Between those two numbers sits a gap of 41 minutes. On the morning of February 1st, a member of Nancy's church congregation noticed she had not appeared for her scheduled live stream service. The family was contacted. Annie and her brother Cameron went to the house. They found her personal belongings. They found her phone still sitting on the nightstand. They did not find her. At approximately noon, they called 911. What Pima County Sheriff's deputies encountered when they entered that residence caused the case to escalate within hours. The word homicide entered the investigation by the following morning. The FBI was called in. U.S. Customs and Border Protection deployed tracking units. The case went federal. And standing at the center of it all, as the last known human contact Nancy Guthrie had before the camera went dark, was Tommaso Chioni. Ask yourself this. You are an investigator. You are standing inside that house. The forensic team has just handed you the pacemaker timestamp. The camera footage has been manually removed. The 41-minute gap sits in front of you like a sealed room with no visible entry point. And you know with complete certainty who the last person was to see this woman alive. Where do you look first? Because federal investigators looked there too. And what they found when they did is coming up next. There is a particular type of person who builds a life so quietly and so consistently that the people around them simply absorb it rather than measure it. They take it for granted the way you take for granted the walls of the room you are sitting in, never thinking about what holds them up until the day something threatens to bring them down. Nancy Guthrie was that kind of person. She was 84 years old. She lived alone in a carefully maintained single-story home in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, a neighborhood that presses against the base of the Santa Catalina Mountains where the evenings carry a stillness that the people who have lived there for decades build their lives around. Nancy had built hers there. Not loudly, not in ways that announced themselves. but with the kind of quiet consistency that, once disrupted, leaves an absence that is impossible to miss. She had 3 children. Her eldest daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is the NBC Today show co-anchor whose face has been a fixture of American morning television for years. Her daughter Annie is a poet, a jeweler, and a former marketing director. And she had a routine, a morning church live stream that she kept with the reliability of someone for whom structure was not a preference, but a foundation. That routine is not a sentimental detail. It is forensic evidence. Because the moment Nancy Guthrie failed to appear for that service on the morning of February 1st, 2026, the alarm was triggered. Not by a security system, not by a neighbor's observation, by the silence where a familiar presence should have been. And in this investigation, that silence turned out to be the first signal that something had gone catastrophically wrong inside that house on the night before. Now let us talk about the physical environment, because the geography of where Nancy lived matters to this case in ways that investigators have been deliberate about. The foothills are elevated. The lots are expansive. The homes are set well back from the street. And the neighborhood operates on a collective awareness, the kind of visibility that comes with wealth and proximity to mountains, where a vehicle idling on the street at 2 in the morning would typically be noticed and remembered by morning. Nobody noticed anything. No neighbor reported an unfamiliar car. No ring camera in the surrounding area captured anything definitive. No motion sensors in adjacent yards triggered. No lights came on in nearby windows. For a neighborhood built on visibility and awareness, the night of January 31st into February 1st produced an almost total absence of external evidence. That level of containment does not happen by accident. It requires either extraordinary good fortune or specific and intimate knowledge of the environment. Knowledge of which streets the doorbell cameras cover. Knowledge of which angles the motion sensors sweep. Knowledge of the neighborhood's rhythms and the gaps in its visibility. The kind of knowledge a stranger would need weeks of surveillance to gather. Or the kind of knowledge a family member already carries without having to work for it at all. And here is the detail about Nancy's physical situation that the news cycle touched and immediately moved past without understanding what it meant. Tommaso Chioni was not a visitor in Nancy's life. He and Annie were a regular, practical presence. They were involved in the logistics of her daily existence in the way that adult children and their partners often are when an aging parent lives alone. Managing the distance between a parent's desire for independence and the practical reality of what maintaining that independence requires. That level of involvement means Tommaso knew her medication schedule. He knew where she kept her phone. He knew when she went to bed and when she woke up. He knew the camera positions. He knew which nights she was alone, and, critically, he knew exactly how long it would take before someone noticed if she was not where she was supposed to be. That is not an accusation. That is a forensic observation. And it is the kind of observation that federal investigators do not step over lightly. Because when the Pima County Sheriff's Department began constructing its investigative response to Nancy's disappearance, the foundational question they asked was not who had a motive. It was simpler and more structural than that. The question was, who knew enough to do this? And the documented, time-stamped, forensically verifiable answer pointed directly to the front door of the last person who had driven Nancy home. The man who had watched the garage seal shut behind her and pulled away into the night with everything he needed already stored in his memory. The investigation into Tommaso Chioni was about to begin. In any serious criminal investigation, there is a specific designation for the individual whose documented timeline places them closest to the victim at the moment the crime occurred. Law enforcement does not reach for dramatic language for this. They use a clinical phrase, precise and deliberately neutral. They call that person a person of interest. Tommaso Chioni became a person of interest the moment the 911 call came in. Not because evidence had been formally assembled against him at that stage. Not because anyone had made an accusation. But because the forensic logic of this case pointed immediately and inescapably toward the last confirmed human contact Nancy Guthrie had before she vanished. And that contact had a name. On February 5, 2026, 4 days after Nancy disappeared, the Pima County Sheriff's Department executed a fully authorized search warrant at the Tucson residence of Tommaso Chioni and Annie Guthrie. A judge had reviewed and signed that warrant. That signature meant investigators had, within 4 days of the 911 call, assembled enough documented probable cause to convince a member of the judiciary that evidence of a crime might be found at that specific address. Judges do not sign search warrants as a courtesy. They sign them because investigators have presented articulable, documented reasons grounded in actual evidence. Deputies entered the home. Blue latex gloves. Systematic movement through every room. Photographs of every surface. Hours of work conducted in full view of news cameras that had taken up positions on the sidewalk outside. The footage aired nationally. The internet, which had already been orbiting this case with the particular energy of a community that believes collective attention moves faster than trained investigation, caught fire. Forums began running side-by-side comparisons of Tommaso Chioni's publicly available photographs against the grainy doorbell footage within hours of the search airing. His height, his build, the posture, the dark facial hair visible at the lower edge of the ski masked the suspect was wearing. People were constructing verdicts in real time out of pixels and assumptions with the confidence of individuals who had never once sat inside a courtroom. But here is what those forums did not know. And here is what the breathless social media commentary entirely missed. The February 5th search was not the last one. 3 days later, on February 7th, law enforcement returned to the same address with a second warrant. This one felt different from the moment it began. The deputies were back in their blue gloves, moving through the property again with the same methodical precision. But this time, what came out of the front door when they finally emerged changed the national conversation about this case in a single image. Brown paper evidence bags, multiple of them, standard forensic packaging for physical items requiring preservation without contamination. And then, the silver forensic briefcase, the kind used exclusively by digital crime investigation units, specifically engineered to transport electronic devices, hard drives, laptops, tablets, and smartphones in a way that prevents any data from being remotely wiped, altered, or accessed during transit. Tommaso Chioni's digital life had just entered federal custody. Every text message, every email, every search query, every location ping logged by every device in that house, every photograph, every deleted file, every login, all of it now in the hands of forensic analysts in a laboratory, being extracted and examined line by line. And then, 11 days after the second search, on February 16th, Sheriff Chris Nanos stood before a room full of cameras and said something that nobody in the national conversation had predicted. He cleared Tommaso Chioni. Completely. Categorically. He cleared Annie. He cleared the entire immediate Guthrie family. He called them victims. He looked directly into those cameras and stated without qualification that the Guthrie family had been subjected to cruel and unfounded public accusations while enduring one of the most devastating experiences of their lives. He asked the media directly to do their jobs with accuracy and with humanity. The internet went quiet for a few hours, then moved on. But here is the question that the clearance does not answer. If Tommaso Chioni and the family were always going to be cleared, if investigators had no evidence connecting them to Nancy's disappearance, then why did it take 2 separate search warrants, the seizure of multiple electronic devices, and 11 days of forensic laboratory analysis to arrive at that conclusion? The answer is rooted in a 1995 United States Supreme Court ruling, Kiles v. Whitley, which established that a defense attorney has the constitutional right to argue that law enforcement conducted an incomplete investigation, that if investigators bypassed obvious leads or failed to rigorously examine the people closest to the victim, a defense team can use that failure to undermine the prosecution's entire case before a jury. The Pima County Sheriff's Department was building a prosecutorial wall. When the actual perpetrator of this crime is eventually charged and brought to trial, no defense attorney on earth will be able to stand up and say investigators took shortcuts. They will be able to say only that every avenue was exhausted, every person of proximity was examined thoroughly, and that the result was a clean and documented clearance. But here is what still does not rest easy. Those silver briefcases do not travel to a forensic laboratory unless, at the moment investigators are carrying them out, they believe something worth finding might be on those devices. The legal strategy explains the searches. It does not explain what investigators thought they saw in those first 11 days that made them look twice. And that answer has never been made public. If you're still here, subscribe, because cases like this only work when people stay and tell us where you're watching from. I love seeing my global family represent. Drop your country or city in the comments. There is a number at the center of this investigation. Not a name. Not a physical artifact you can hold under a forensic light. A number. 41. And when you understand precisely what that number represents and precisely what it eliminates, it does more damage to the professional kidnapping narrative than any single item of physical evidence recovered from that home. Let us build the timeline from the beginning. At 9:48 p.m. on January 31st, 2026, Tommaso Chioni pulls up to Nancy Guthrie's residence. She goes inside. At 9:50 p.m., the garage door closes. That timestamp is not approximated. It is not a neighbor's recollection reconstructed from memory. It is a digitally recorded event logged by the garage door's own operational system. Nancy is inside. The property is secure. The next several hours produce nothing. No motion alerts. No camera triggers. No digital disturbances of any kind. The house sits undisturbed through the late evening, through midnight, through the early hours of a morning when the Catalina Foothills neighborhood is at its most absolute stillness. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera captures a figure on the front porch. The figure approaches the lens. The feed is manually disconnected. The house goes dark in every sense. No recording. No visual evidence. No digital eyes left running anywhere on that property. And then, at 2:28 a.m., the Bluetooth monitoring application on Nancy Guthrie's iPhone registers a disconnect. The signal between her pacemaker and her phone, transmitting her cardiac data continuously and without interruption throughout the entire evening, breaks. The app logs the timestamp automatically. 2:28 a.m. connection lost. From 1:47 a.m. to 2:28 a.m., 41 minutes. Now here is why that number tears the professional kidnapping narrative apart at its foundation. In a targeted abduction scenario, in the operational framework that every major news outlet was promoting in those first 72 hours, speed is not a preference. It is the entire structural imperative of the operation. A professional team moving against a non-resistant, mobility-limited elderly target does not browse, does not search, does not take its time. The objective is singular: breach, locate, extract, disappear. Against a target who cannot run and cannot physically fight back. That sequence should take no more than 3 to 5 minutes from the moment of entry to the moment the vehicle clears the block. That is not opinion. That is the operational reality of how targeted abductions function across every documented case study, every forensic analysis, every behavioral profile assembled by the FBI's Violent Crime Unit. Speed is survival. Every additional minute inside a residential property is another minute of exposure, another minute for something external to go wrong in a way that cannot be controlled from inside that house. This person stayed for 41 minutes. 41 minutes is not a brief operational window. It is enough time to move through every room of an average single-story home twice. It is enough time to open drawers, check closets, go through documents, locate and attempt to access a safe. It is enough time, if something went wrong the moment that front door opened, to spend the majority of that window reacting to a situation that was never part of the plan. 3 theories have emerged from the forensic analysis of this timeline. The first is coordination, that the individual inside was waiting for a signal, a vehicle that had not yet arrived, confirmation that an external route was clear. The second is search, that the person was not there primarily for Nancy, that they were looking for something specific inside that house, and that Nancy herself was secondary to that objective or an unforeseen complication within it. The third theory is the one that federal investigators have been most careful about discussing publicly, and it is the theory that the physical evidence recovered from the front entrance of that home supports most directly. The plan did not survive contact with what was behind that door. Something went wrong within the first seconds of entry, and those 41 minutes were not operational time. They were not waiting time. They were the time it takes to manage a situation that has already moved outside the boundaries of what was planned for. Now combine that theory with this detail. The biological traces recovered from the front entrance of Nancy's home were located at the threshold, not deep inside the property, not in a hallway or a bedroom further in. At the entrance, at the exact point of first contact between whatever was waiting inside that house and whoever came through that door. That location tells investigators that the critical physical sequence of events on the night of February 1st did not begin in the interior of that home. It began immediately, in the first seconds, at the front door. And that is not the signature of an abduction proceeding according to plan. That is the signature of an abduction that encountered something unexpected the moment it began. Ask yourself this. You are Tommaso Chioni. It is 9:50 in the evening. You have just watched the garage door close behind your mother-in-law. You know her routine with the intimacy of someone who has been present in her life for years. You know her medication schedule. You know exactly where her phone sits at night. You know what that phone is monitoring, and you know what timestamp the application on that phone will record the moment the Bluetooth signal breaks. You know the camera positions. You know the neighborhood. If you were going to send someone to that house in the middle of the night, what time would you tell them to arrive? And how long would you tell them they had before the digital architecture of that house began telling a story you could not control? 4 hours and 57 minutes after that garage door closed, someone arrived. That is not a coincidence. That is a calculation. And the person who possessed every variable required to make that calculation accurately, who knew every timestamp and every digital tripwire in that house, had driven away from that property at 9:50 p.m. with all of it already in his head. On February 10th, 2026, the FBI released doorbell camera footage to the public. not the original recording that had been physically removed from the device during the 41-minute window. What was released was recovered from the back-end residual data of the camera system itself. Fragments, partial frames, enough to construct a sequence, enough to show investigators, and eventually the world, what had been standing on Nancy Guthrie's porch at 1:47 in the morning. The footage is low resolution in the way that residential doorbell cameras almost always are, functional enough to confirm presence, too degraded to confirm identity. But degraded footage is not useless footage. Not to a trained behavioral analyst. Not to the FBI profilers who had been sitting with this material since the earliest hours of February 1st, slowing it down, isolating frames, running enhancement software, and doing the specific work they are trained to do. They were not looking for a face. They were looking for behavior. And what that behavioral analysis revealed about the individual on that porch did not match the profile of a professional. It matched something more personal. Something more driven by proximity and fear than by experience and calculation. Start with the clothing. The suspect is visibly wearing multiple heavy garments stacked on top of one another. This is not functional cold weather layering. Tucson in February drops to the low 40s overnight. Cold enough for a jacket. Not cold enough for the kind of deliberate excessive bulk this figure is carrying. The layering is structural. It creates a silhouette that has been artificially widened, shaped to obscure the natural lines of the body underneath. Every physical characteristic that a forensic analyst would use to establish a body measurement profile has been buried in fabric. That is not improvised. It is premeditated. He is wearing a ski mask. Expected. Any individual with basic awareness of forensic evidence conceals their face. But behavioral analysts noted what appears to be a second layer of face covering beneath the ski mask. Additional material pressed directly against the skin, providing a secondary barrier between the face and any surface that might collect biological trace material. And the hands. 2 pairs of gloves, layered directly over one another. Consider what your hands need to do in an operation like this. You need to disconnect a camera. You need to manage a point of entry. You need to control a human being. Your hands in this scenario are your primary tool. They require precision and dexterity and rapid fine motor response. 2 pairs of gloves destroys fine motor control. The outer layer reduces tactile sensitivity to near zero. It turns capable hands into something slow and imprecise. No professional criminal doubles their gloves. 1 pair addresses the forensic requirement, and that is the end of the calculation. The second pair is not a professional precaution. It is a pathological one. And that distinction between professional precaution and pathological terror is precisely what behavioral analysts flagged in this footage. A professional criminal layers their protections to the threshold of operational efficiency and stops there. 2 face coverings, 2 pairs of gloves, multiple clothing layers engineered to distort body shape. These are not the preparations of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how much coverage is enough. These are the preparations of someone who is specifically, personally terrified of being connected to this location, this victim, and this crime. That level of terror does not emerge from a general fear of apprehension. Career criminals carry that fear as background noise. It becomes managed, calculated, routine. This level of terror comes from proximity, from knowing that when investigators begin working backward through this case, the people they examine first are the people closest to the victim. From knowing that a single fiber, a single partial print, a single microscopic biological trace is not just evidence of presence at a crime scene. It is evidence of a specific relationship to the person at the center of it. You do not wear 2 pairs of gloves because you are afraid of leaving fingerprints in the abstract. You wear 2 pairs of gloves because you know that the person who will be asked about fingerprints first is you. Then there is the firearm, pushed loosely into the front waistband. No holster, no retention device. In any professional or tactical context, an unsecured waistband carry is not a method. It is a liability. The weapon is unstable. It shifts with movement. It is dangerous to the person carrying it and operationally unreliable at the moment it is needed. Officers carry in holsters. Security professionals carry in holsters. Even experienced criminal operators carry in holsters, because a weapon that falls or discharges at the wrong moment ends an operation faster than any investigator could. This weapon was just pushed in, loose, angled, uncomfortable. That is not the firearm carry of someone with prior experience carrying concealed. That is the firearm carry of someone who acquired a weapon specifically for this night. Someone for whom the gun was as much a prop as a tool, something designed to project control rather than something they knew how to exercise with efficiency. The FBI's behavioral analysis of this footage reached a conclusion that recalibrated the entire investigative direction of this case. The person on that porch was not a hired professional, was not an experienced operator. was not someone who had done anything resembling this before. The person on that porch was acting out of personal motivation, out of a specific, identifiable reason to be at that specific address, on that specific night, with that specific woman as the target. Someone who knew Nancy Guthrie. And the name that sat at the top of every investigator's list of people who knew Nancy Guthrie had not shifted since the moment this investigation began. Coming up, the ransom demands that were never designed to succeed. The financial architecture of a kidnapping constructed not to collect money, but to create a story. And the detail buried inside those demands that federal investigators say revealed the nature of this operation within 48 hours of receiving them. Every legitimate ransom operation in the documented history of criminal kidnapping shares one structural requirement, one foundational obligation that separates a genuine extortion from everything else. That requirement is follow-through. A kidnapper who wants money stays in contact. They enforce their deadlines. They provide proof that the person they are holding is alive. They respond to the family's attempts to engage. They push. They negotiate. They remain inside the conversation because the conversation is the only leverage they possess. Silence is not a negotiating tactic. Silence is either structural failure or deliberate design. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the ransom demands that surfaced in the days following her disappearance carried, on their surface, all the vocabulary of a serious criminal enterprise. Large figures, cryptocurrency, deadlines. The surface language of a calculated operation targeting a family with a nationally recognized public profile. Savannah Guthrie is one of the most visible faces in American television news. The assumption the headlines reached for immediately was that Nancy had been taken because of that connection, that this was a professional extraction designed to leverage a famous daughter's resources. But when federal investigators sat down with the actual operational mechanics of those demands, not the language, not the dollar figures, but the underlying structure of how those demands were built and how they behaved over time, what they found did not look like a professional ransom operation. It looked like theater. The demands were vague where they should have been specific. They were specific where they should have allowed room to negotiate. A genuine ransom operation builds flexibility into its framework deliberately because a professional kidnapper needs the family functional, cooperative, and capable of moving money through channels that require time to navigate. These demands did not build that room. And then the deadlines came. And then the deadlines passed. No follow-up contact. No response to the family's attempts to engage. No proof of life at any stage. Not a voice recording. Not a photograph. Not a single verifiable signal that Nancy Guthrie was alive and in anyone's custody. In a real kidnapping, proof of life is not optional. It is the foundational transaction that makes the entire operation viable. The kidnapper provides it. The family confirms it. The negotiation proceeds. Without it, there is nothing to negotiate. The silence after each missed deadline was complete. On February 7th, Savannah Guthrie released a video statement watched by millions within hours. Her voice controlled. Her words deliberate. She said what any daughter in her position would say. The family would pay. They wanted their mother back. They were asking whoever had Nancy to make contact. The response was silence. A demand surfaced carrying a figure of $6 million and a deadline of February 9th. The family was ready. Investigators were monitoring every available channel. February 9th arrived and passed without a single word from whoever had sent it. On the same day as the first search warrant, February 5th, federal authorities in California arrested an individual on charges of making fraudulent ransom demands to the Guthrie family. This person had no connection to Nancy's actual disappearance. He was an opportunist who had identified a grieving, high-profile family in the news and built a fraudulent extortion scheme around their desperation. His arrest clarified something important. Not all of the demands that reached the Guthrie family came from the same source. Criminal noise was layered over the actual case, muddying the investigative signal in ways that made it significantly harder to identify which communications, if any, were genuine. But here's what that California arrest did not explain. It did not account for the structural failures of the demands that federal investigators believed were directly connected to the actual disappearance. The absent proof of life. The deadlines that expired in silence. The complete absence of follow-up contact after that $6 million figure evaporated. Federal investigators reached a conclusion about those specific demands that has never been publicly articulated in full. But the outline of that conclusion is visible in the forensic record if you know what to look for. The demands connected to this case were not built to result in a financial transaction. They were not constructed to close. They were constructed to look like they were constructed to close. And there is a fundamental difference between those two things. A professional kidnapper engineers a demand to succeed. Someone staging a kidnapping engineers a demand to be seen, to construct a narrative, to redirect investigative attention toward cryptocurrency transfers and missed deadlines rather than toward forensic timelines and 41-minute gaps. And the person with the most to gain from investigators spending their first critical days chasing phantom ransom logistics rather than examining the digital record of a Thursday evening in the Catalina foothills did not need the ransom to succeed. They needed it to exist. Every crime scene tells two stories. The first is the one the perpetrator intended to leave behind. The carefully positioned narrative of physical evidence arranged to steer investigators toward a specific conclusion. The second story is the one the perpetrator did not intend to leave behind. The microscopic, the accidental, the biological. The story told not by what was placed, but by what was shed, without awareness, without control, and without the possibility of going back to erase it. In the Nancy Guthrie case, the second story was written in DNA from the earliest hours of the investigation. Pima County Sheriff's deputies and FBI forensic teams working the crime scene at the Catalina Foothills residence were swabbing surfaces, packaging materials, processing the front entrance. Every point of contact the forensic timeline indicated had been active during the 41-minute window. The biological traces at the threshold had already told investigators that the critical physical sequence of events on the night of February 1st began at the point of first contact, at the front door. But they were looking beyond Nancy's own biological material. They were looking for whoever had been in that house with her. Approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's residence, they found a glove. A single glove, discarded in the way that objects get left behind when someone is moving fast. When the adrenaline of what just happened is still running at full volume, and the priority is distance rather than discipline. The glove was collected, packaged, and sent to the forensic laboratory. DNA was extracted from the interior lining, the surface that had been in direct contact with the skin of whoever wore it. The profile was run through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, a national forensic database containing genetic profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees, and forensic evidence recovered from crime scenes across the country. If the person who wore that glove had any prior interaction with the criminal justice system at any level, CODIS would identify them. CODIS returned no match. The profile belonged to no one in the database. Whoever wore that glove had no prior criminal record that had generated a DNA sample. In the language of forensic investigation, they were a forensic unknown, present in the evidence, absent from the system. Investigators then initiated a process called investigative genetic genealogy, the same methodology that cracked the Golden State Killer case in 2018. This technique takes an unknown DNA profile and traces it not through criminal databases, but through publicly available genealogical platforms, ancestry services, family tree submissions, the vast accumulated record of people who have voluntarily submitted their genetic material to trace their heritage. By identifying distant relatives of the unknown profile, investigators can build a family tree outward and then narrow it inward to pinpoint the specific individual the DNA belongs to. That process, in the Nancy Guthrie case, eventually produced a lead. The DNA from the glove was traced to an individual connected to a local restaurant. A worker. Someone with no apparent connection to Nancy Guthrie and no apparent connection to the Guthrie family. At any level, investigators could initially map. The sheriff confirmed this publicly. He confirmed the restaurant connection. He confirmed the individual had been located and interviewed. And then he confirmed something that added an entirely new layer of complexity to an already intricate forensic picture. The DNA on that glove was not a clean single contributor profile. It was mixed. More than one person's biological material was present on the interior surface. The primary contributor had been traced to the restaurant worker. The secondary contributor, the additional biological material woven into that same sample, had not been successfully resolved into a complete, identifiable profile. Mixed DNA profiles are among the most technically demanding problems in forensic science. When two or more contributors are present in the same sample, separating those profiles cleanly requires a level of laboratory analysis that takes significant time and does not always yield a definitive result. The secondary profile in that glove sample had not produced a complete identification as of the most recent public statements from investigators. But the glove was not the only item recovered. In the days following Nancy's disappearance, search teams combing the neighborhood recovered a total of 16 pairs of gloves spread across the surrounding area. Investigators confirmed that the majority were traced to search and rescue personnel. Standard issue. Accounted for. But majority is a word doing a significant amount of work in that sentence, because majority means not all. And the pairs not accounted for by search team records remained in the forensic queue awaiting analysis. Then there was the vehicle. A neighbor's Ring camera approximately 2.5 miles from Nancy's residence captured footage of a car moving through the corridor at 2:36 a.m. on February 1st, 8 minutes after the pacemaker Bluetooth disconnect logged at 2:28 a.m. The vehicle's make, model, and registration have not been publicly confirmed. Its presence in that specific area at that specific time has not been explained. And as of the most recent public statements from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, that vehicle remains unidentified. The mixed secondary DNA profile. The unresolved gloves. The unidentified vehicle moving through the neighborhood 8 minutes after the pacemaker went silent. Each examined individually is a thread, a single line of inquiry. But pull all of them at the same time, and the picture they form is not of a professional operation that dissolved cleanly into the desert night. It is the picture of someone who left in a hurry, who shed material, who was not as protected as the double gloves and double mask and engineered silhouette were supposed to guarantee. Someone who prepared extensively and still left a trail. 6 weeks. That is how long Nancy Guthrie has been missing as of today, March 16, 2026. 6 weeks since the garage door sealed shut at 9:50 p.m. 6 weeks since the camera went dark at 1:47 a.m. 6 weeks since the pacemaker application logged its final timestamp and the Bluetooth signal between a daughter's monitoring device and her mother's heartbeat went permanently silent. 6 weeks and no arrest. In the architecture of a major federal criminal investigation, 6 weeks is not an eternity. Complex cases take time. Forensic laboratory analysis takes time. Investigative genetic genealogy takes time. Building a prosecutable case that will survive the scrutiny of a defense team and hold together in front of a jury takes time. Investigators will tell you this at every press conference when a reporter pushes a microphone toward them and asks why no one has been charged. But 6 weeks in a missing persons case is different. Because every day that passes without a resolution is another day. Physical evidence degrades, witness memories shift, digital trails go colder, and the window for finding Nancy Guthrie alive, a window many investigators privately acknowledged was narrow from the very beginning, closes further. Sheriff Chris Nanos has been the public face of this investigation since day one. He has stood at that podium through press conference after press conference fielding questions that the investigation has not yet been able to publicly answer. And what he has said at those press conferences, when you strip the careful language away and read the forensic subtext underneath, tells a specific story about exactly where this case stands. He has said investigators believe they know why Nancy was targeted. Not who. Why. That distinction matters. Knowing the motive before identifying the perpetrator means investigators have built a profile of this operation from the inside out. They understand its logic. They understand what the perpetrator wanted and why they wanted it. What they have not yet done, or not yet been willing to say publicly, is connect that motive to a specific name with enough documented evidence to support an arrest. He has said he believes the perpetrator could strike again. That statement is not casual. A sheriff does not stand before cameras and issue a public threat warning unless investigators have a specific documented reason to believe the threat is real. That warning tells us something about the profile they have assembled. This was not random. This was not opportunistic. This was targeted, calculated, and driven by a specific reason to choose Nancy Guthrie and no one else. He has said the investigation is making progress. That investigators are, in his words, definitely closer than they were. The FBI shifted its command post operations from Tucson to Phoenix in the weeks following the ground search phase, a move some analysts interpreted as the investigation transitioning from an active physical search into a forensic and intelligence operation being run at distance. The FBI pushed back on that reading. They insisted the case remains fully active and fully resourced. A combined reward totaling $1,200,000 has been assembled from contributions by the Guthrie family, Pima County, and public donors. That reward has generated tens of thousands of tips. Every single one must be processed, cross-referenced against the forensic record, and either incorporated into the investigative picture or eliminated. That process takes months of analytical work compressed into weeks by a team already carrying the full weight of a federal criminal investigation. 2 individuals were detained and questioned in the weeks following Nancy's disappearance. Both were released without charge. Neither has been publicly identified. Neither has been named as a suspect. And the DNA, the mixed profile from the glove, the unresolved secondary contributor, the investigative genetic genealogy process still running somewhere in a forensic laboratory, remains the most viable open thread in the entire case. Sheriff Nanos said it himself, on the record, in front of cameras. That DNA, he stated, is going to lead us to somebody. The question is when. And the question underneath that one, The question that has been present in this investigation since the moment the camera went dark on February 1st is whether the somebody that DNA leads to is a stranger or someone Nancy Guthrie already knew. Here's what we know. Not what the forums are circulating. Not what the first 72 hours of headlines chose to emphasize when the story was new and the facts were still being established. What the verified, documented, forensically confirmed record of this investigation actually tells us. Tommaso Chioni drove Nancy Guthrie home and watched the garage close at 9:50 p.m. on January 31st, 2026. He was the last known person to see her alive. 4 hours and 57 minutes later, a masked individual carrying an unsecured firearm and wearing 2 pairs of gloves over 2 layers of face covering walked up to her porch, manually disconnected the doorbell camera, and entered the home. The pacemaker Bluetooth signal severed at 2:28 a.m., 41 minutes after the camera went dark. Biological traces belonging to Nancy were recovered from the front entrance threshold. A glove was found 2 miles away containing mixed DNA that has not been fully resolved. A vehicle moved through the surrounding area 8 minutes after the pacemaker went silent and has never been identified. The ransom demands that followed carried no proof of life, honored no deadlines, and produced no further contact after the $6 million figure was issued and passed by in silence. Every thread in this investigation, pulled far enough, returns to the same set of questions. Who knew Nancy's routine with enough precision to plan around it? Who knew the camera positions? Who knew her medication schedule? Who knew that a pacemaker monitoring application on a nightstand phone was logging cardiac data in real time? And who understood exactly what timestamp that application would record the moment the Bluetooth signal broke? Tommaso Chioni has not been charged. He has not been publicly named as a suspect. The Pima County Sheriff's Department cleared him and his family on February 16, 2026, and that clearance is part of the official record. Nothing in this investigation as it currently exists in the public domain constitutes legal evidence of his involvement. But the forensic record does not clear him of proximity. It does not clear him of knowledge. It does not clear him of being the person who understood that house, that woman, that night, better than anyone else who has come under investigative scrutiny in the 6 weeks since Nancy Guthrie disappeared. The case is open. The DNA is in the laboratory. The reward stands at $1,200,000. The FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL-FBI, remains active. And somewhere in Tucson, Arizona, in a forensic file that has not yet been fully read, is the answer to the question that has been sitting at the center of this investigation since a garage door rolled shut at 9:50 p.m. and his son-in-law drove away into the night. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had a pacemaker connected to a phone on her nightstand. She went home on a Thursday evening and never came back. And the person who knows exactly what happened inside that house during those 41 minutes of silence is still out there. That is not a theory. That is what the evidence says. Now here is what you need to do right now. If this case matters to you, if Nancy Guthrie's name deserves to be more than a headline that faded after the first news cycle, share this video today. Send it to one person who follows true crime, one person who pays attention, one person who understands that the more people who know the real forensic details of a case like this, the harder it becomes for the truth to stay buried. Subscribe to Cold Case History if you are not already here. Turn on your notifications. We will be covering every single development in this case the moment it breaks, with the same forensic depth, the same documented precision, and the same refusal to flinch from where the evidence actually leads. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which of these 5 forensic details you would pull on first if you were the lead investigator. And tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. Because this community stretches further than you know, and Nancy Guthrie's story reaches all of it. She has been missing for 6 weeks. Her family is waiting. The DNA is in the laboratory. And this case is not over.